Dr. Ron Cole-Turner is our main presenter for the day. And I guess I just want to say that he was actually a reader for my Doctor of Ministry program that I did on stem cells at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. So this is especially pleasant for me. Ron it holds the H. Parker Sharp Chair in Theology and Ethics at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He has devoted most of his career over the last 30 years at least to exploring science and technology and how it impacts religious perspectives, particularly for Christianity. He's worked in such things as human evolution, the expanding powers of technology to modify humanity, transhumanism, post-humanism, and many others. His recent publications include Transhumanism and Transcendence, Christian Hope in an Age of Technological Enhancement, and The End of Adam and Eve, Theology and the Science of Human Origins. He's a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion, and now he serves on the executive committee. Ron is going to talk about human mystery, unraveling the past, exploring the future. Ron, it's all yours. Oh, and let me just remind everybody, if you have any questions, please begin entering them anytime you want in the Q&A box. It's there for you to be able to ask questions so that we can get Ron to answer them at the end. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Gail. It's a real joy to share this event with you. Gail Wallachek, our moderator for this evening. Thank you to Maynard and to CJ Love, somewhat in the background. Both of you worked so hard to bring this series to life. Thank you for the invitation to share with folks in this event today. I have a lot to say, so I am going to go straight to the slides. I hope that won't bother anybody. Let's see, here we are. All right. Yes, the human mystery. Where have we come from? Where are we going? And emphasizing the word mystery because it's not clear in the past and it's not clear in the future. So here's what I want to try to do here tonight. I want to introduce you to a very quick, highly selective overview of recent findings in the science of human origins. And then after maybe 15, 20, probably 25 minutes, I will pivot to the question of the future of humanity. Can we use technology to take our future evolution into our own hands? And if we can, to any extent whatsoever, should we? And with that, of course, come at least two worries. I'm sure we could add to that list. But number one, will human enhancement and transhumanism lead to the post-human or to the end of humanity as we know it? And should that be a concern? And in the light of past human diversity, can we affirm human unity? So here's the start for the scope of tonight's talk. No, we did not evolve from chimps, but about 7 million years ago, we shared what biologists refer to as the last common ancestor. In fact, if you compare the human skull with the chimp skull, you can see remarkable similarities and yet also remarkable differences. And brain size is not the only one, but it's probably the most obvious one. Look at this chart for just a moment. We're going to be concentrating our attention on this area where the blue and the, what is that, purple, I guess, violet, diverge. And it took a while for the last common ancestor right there at that nub in this branch to lead to two different lineages, the blue leading to us and the purple leading to the chimpanzees. Now, if you go on up to the very top, you'll see some interesting things happen. The genus Homo appears 2 million years ago, maybe a bit earlier. But then there's all kinds of drama as the genus Homo diversifies into various forms or species of the genus Homo. including chiefly Homo erectus, and then only late in time Homo sapiens. But then the drama isn't over. If you can see to the very top of the blue, you'll see separating lines and joining lines, diverging and converging. If there's one motif that runs through the next few minutes, it will be this ongoing recycling of this theme of divergence and convergence. If we were to go to the back here to the core of the last common ancestor, in fact, if you follow up here, you'll see Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus is a discovery first announced in 1994, but then finally published in 2009. That takes us back as close as we are able to go to what this last common ancestor must have been like. But this is quite a bit later than the last common ancestor. If the divergence occurred around 7 million years ago, already here we're at 4.4 million years ago. So this only takes us back somewhat. But Ardipithecus is the first big, relatively complete skeleton that we have to give us some clue as to where we have come from in the distant past. Ardipithecus, by comparison, the genus Australopithecus, most famous exemplar being Lucy, comes later. She lived at around 3.1 million years ago. Ardi, as she is known, probably female, this particular individual skeleton, lived more at in the range of 4.5 million years ago. Her hand, very strong compared to ours, not so agile, but you see the opposable thumb clearly present. So there is some capacity to grasp not just branches from which to hang, but finer things and indeed to carry them. The foot, opposable toe, is still present, but much more, well, slightly more foot-like, if you will. Teeth, likewise. At the bottom, we see the chimp jaw. At the top, we see Ardipithecus. Possibly smaller because it's female, possibly smaller because there's a progression in tooth size, leading to smaller and smaller teeth, including especially the canine teeth. So moving right along, we go forward from Ardipithecus at 4.5 million years ago to Australopithecus, and you see the range roughly 4 to roughly 3 million years ago, with Lucy somewhat right in the middle. Most of us grew up knowing the story of Lucy and its discovery. Name for the Beatles hit, but a real revelation in terms of opening up the field of human origins research to a wider and wider audience. Okay, so Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, next will be the genus Homo. So what? What do these labels actually mean? Well, reminder, we're talking about genus labels. These are very broad classifications in which we have specific, or we have species. What are they? Relatively distinguishable forms. This is almost impossible to speak with any clarity of it when we have so few examples. But the concept of species means a lot in biology as we look around us to living organisms. Is it possible to cluster these specimens not just into broad classifications, but into species classifications? Yes, I guess, but one has to be really, really cautious about what we're doing here. As I say to the students when we talk about this, these bones don't come out of the ground with barcodes. It's not out of thin air that the experts classify them. They do have some agreed rules, but it's not on anything actually found in the data, but in the way in which clusterings and meaningful distinctions seem to be possible. Underscore very much, we have very limited data when we go back more than 2 million years ago. In fact, there's limited data all the way through. We have at most fragments. We have single points of information that stand out against an otherwise complete void in terms of comprehension. Meaningful, yes. Illuminating or clear, no. Hence, at the very least, a profound mystery of human origins. We have, in other words, fossilized bones and chipped stones. So welcome to the world of bones and stones. Here, speaking of stones, is a recent publication, front page of the journal, cover of the journal Nature, on a discovery that pushes the date of stone tools back to an astounding 3.3 million years ago. These are so-called Lomequian tools, named as these things are for the location in which they're first found. I don't know, they don't look like stone tools to me, but then again, they were found together with the chips that had been actually removed. So it's pretty convincing. Found, I should say, because a group of researchers took a wrong turn and got slightly lost and then said, well, let's look where we are. And lo and behold, discovery of a lifetime of the earliest stone tools. Lomequian at about 3.5 million years ago, gradually replaced. Oh, we live in a different age, don't we? How fast do you have to replace your mobile phone? But Lomequian, roughly a 1,000,000-year run. In fact, this is the only example we have of it. Replaced by Oldovan tools from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, sometimes referred to as Mode 1, and you see the dates on that. Leakey, who first discovered these, thought, well, that Homo habilis, Homo had to make these because only humans can make tools, so we'll call them the early version of the tool-making human. But as you can see, with the Lomequian tools, tools predate Homo habilis. Do they predate the genus Homo? Well, we'll go to that question in just a second. Only over a period of time, roughly 2 million years ago, Acheulean tools appear, and then they take an astounding 1,000,000 years to spread from where they're first discovered in East Africa to Eurasia, despite the fact that we're pretty sure Homo erectus was going back and forth all the time. Anyway, Lomequian tools predate the genus Homo, or does it really? Most recent claim for the earliest evidence of the genus Homo takes us back to 2.8 million years. Not everybody's comfortable with that because this is the evidence. This piece and this piece only. Small teeth, yeah. Kind of human looking, yeah, but really, are you going to look at that and say, oh, that's the dawn of humanity, that's the dawn of the genus Homo? That isn't a big, big claim, even for biologists. And so based on that little fragment, here it is shown from different angles and mirrored in C and D, so you can see what it might have looked like. But is that it? Well, here's the paper, Journal Science, about 6 years ago, 2.8 million years ago, in the right place, supposedly. That's where a lot of these early findings come from, Ardipithecus, as well as this particular example. But it's controversial, to put it mildly. Is it really, is this mere half mandible really evidence of a new genus? Particularly, folks, the new genus Homo, which is kind of dear to our hearts. There's no drum roll when we appear. There's no flash of lights in the sky. No, just that little bit of a bone, and we're not even sure what it is. How did we get here? Gosh, what we know is so incredibly fragmentary compared to what we do not know and may never know. Do different forms of humanity or species of humanity. Well, they existed side by side in the past. We're going to look at more evidence of that in just a moment. How do we understand that complexity of multiplicity of forms or species of the genus Homo? How do we understand the unity of the genus Homo, particularly going forward to today? When did we become human, slightly human, fully human, either biologically or culturally? We're going to be talking about the cultural side of this in a few minutes, but biologically, there are no clear answers. Cultural Big Bang, that was the prevailing thesis about 15 years or so ago. I think that needs to be replaced by something we could call sparks everywhere instead of a cultural Big Bang. And likewise, the biology, it comes in bits and pieces. Homo erectus does appear around what, 1.9 million years ago, we think in East Africa, but almost immediately shows up here at Denisi, Georgia, and you can see that on the map. Not exactly easy territory. I guess more calm back then than now, but here's what was found. One skull of 5 found when digging at this site in south central Georgia. An artist's rendering of that skull. One has to be very careful about these drawings, but there it is. There are the 5 that were found lined up, and you can see differences. Note particularly number 3 in the middle and number 5 on the right. The more complete ones, you can see significant differences. Look at the brow ridge, for instance. Look at the brain, the skull shape around the back of the brain. Here they are straight on, and you can see these differences, particularly again, 3 and 5. That's an enormous variation in one site. Different species, not likely. Maybe they lived at slightly different times. That can't be ruled out entirely. But different species, probably not. Probably Homo erectus, probably quite similar. Well, known to be quite similar to similar bones found in Africa at around the same time. How did they get there so fast? How did they multiply? And what kind of diversity did they carry within their own community? Again, questions that are tantalizing. Now, we're going to jump very quickly here from the bones from Denisi are around just under 1.9 million years ago. We're jumping a million years plus here to Neanderthals. And we'll pick up the story with Neanderthals. In between, Homo erectus is the dominant player around the globe, except for the Americas, of course, but the dominant player. But somehow, in transition over time, through pathways not yet understood very well at all, somehow a newer, different form of humanity appears in Eurasia. And we know them as the Neanderthals, with some differences east and west. But we also have learned about the discovery of another form of archaic human, hominin, named for the cave in which they were found, roughly at the border between Mongolia, China, and Russia. The Denisovan, the Denisova cave and the Denisovans, as they have come to be known. And the revolutionary power of this discovery is that it was not from anything resembling a complete skeleton, but from the remarkable ability of science today to reconstruct DNA sequence data from archaic hominins, archaic living creatures, from bone samples that are fossilized. And I mean, this is just almost unimaginable if you went back 30 or 40 years ago in the history of science. But the techniques continue to advance, and not only can these archaic genomes be worked out, but then of course they can be compared. So you take earlier or contemporary forms of Homo sapiens, compare them with Neanderthals, compare them with Denisovans, and you have a whole new window into the past. Now that window only opens back a certain range. Obviously, they want to keep pushing this back earlier and earlier, but it's best exercised in the last 100,000 years, roughly. And the discoveries keep coming in. This is laborious work, but it's being advanced with great skill and care. Here's a picture of the Denisovan cave. Country looks like where I live here in Pennsylvania. Now, here's an interpretation 5 years ago, and I think this is worth reading. We view the emergence of our lineage, that would be the entire hominin lineage since the branching off from the last common ancestor, of our lineage as a dynamic, as a continuing dynamic, a process, in other words, rather than an outcome or a product. There is no clear starting point. Remember the murkiness of the last common ancestor, or ending point, but rather an ongoing, repeating process of divergence and hybridization at multiple points in its evolutionary history. That phrase is, I think, almost revelatory. Divergence and hybridization, or as I sometimes will put it, divergence and convergence. Divergence and hybridization. It is the dynamics of this repeated lineage, divergence, and remerger that has produced the variation observable in our genome and phenome today, our body shape. We would not expect the directional accumulation of modernity in such a scenario, but rather a sporadic, flickering signal. There's just an awful lot packed into that, and in some respects, the next 5 minutes will be spent unpacking that. This is the image. It's not a simple tree, like a family tree. Which is the root? Which is the tree? Which is the branch on which we are located? Multiple sources of humanity today that diverge at places and then join back together. A fundamentally new image of the human family tree. And to complicate, more discoveries. Homo naledi. What on earth is this? This is the, they made the cover of National Geographic about 6 years ago. At that point, they based on the bones, they were dated to something pushing 2 million years ago. I mean, if you looked at their bones and compared them with other skeletons, we'd say, well, maybe 2 million years, roughly, give or take. Well, new evidence suggests that they are remarkably young. What are we to make of that? They seem older, but they lived on. What, as a isolated population? Or at what point were they tapped in to the various branches and divergences and convergences of our humanity? And to make matters more complicated, recent discovery, if you look right in the middle of this map, you'll see Manila. So you can orient off of that. Manila in the Philippines, this cave, this little tiny fragment from which now we can identify this is a different species. Yeah, close to Homo erectus, but maybe, well, it's clearly not Homo sapiens. What is it? But yet it's living into remarkably modern times. So let's hone in here a little bit on Homo sapiens and what we might mean by that. Here is a composite reconstruction from Jebel Arud in Morocco, and the dates are a little bit broad there, but is this Homo sapiens? Well, heavy brow ridge, heavier bone and facial structure, but it's got features that are, as the biologist put it, derived, or as us non-biologists might want to put it cautiously, we might want to say modern. But again, one has to be really careful about that kind of prejudicial language. Derived features. Note, compare the dates at the top there with Homo naledi. If I put the Homo naledi's skull next to it, you'd see a remarkable difference. This slide, I think, is really, really important. We just looked at Jebel-Arud up in the upper left of the slide, Morocco, roughly 300,000 years ago. But look around at all of the other slides. Down at the bottom is the Homo naledi discovery, but the others are absolutely fascinating. Which ones qualify as Homo sapiens? Which ones have features that seem to be found in Homo sapiens? As you can see, it's a complicated story covering the entire staggeringly huge continent of Africa. Action in Ethiopia and Somalia, well, of course, but not exclusively there, not exclusively by any means. And so all of Africa, not just East Africa, seems to be the source of our species Homo sapiens, and a little bit here and a little bit there, coming together through that process of divergence, but in this case, convergence. Traits evolved in one place come together with traits evolved in another place over time through a process of convergence. Now, almost immediately, the emerging hybrid species, in quotes, Homo sapiens, is pushing the boundaries of Africa. Note the dates at the bottom of this. We thought until recently that Homo sapiens first emerged in Africa as a discrete species and then only much later migrated out of Africa. Well, they emerge and they migrate all at once, bits and pieces. This is not a successful move out of Africa on the part of these newly formed hybrid humans, but you see the evidence that they are already moving in a new direction. All right, let's think a little bit about culture as a parallel track. And again, mostly up until a particular point, all we have are stones, right? Stone tools. But suddenly things begin to change, and there are traces of what might be seen as symbolic artifacts that evoke a sense of a symbolic capacity that lead people to want to use terms like modern, but again, use that with a great deal of restraint and caution. Is it a big bang or is it gradual? There's a tendency for us to want to say the light goes on in a flash. It's a big bang. Slow emergence of symbolism seems to be hard to comprehend. Is it okay to think of it as a slow process? Beads, they're shells, of course, but they are carefully drilled and were probably used as beads 100,000 plus years ago. This is also from 100,000 years ago. It is arguably the first chemical engineering factory. People there on the tip of South Africa, going one way to gather one thing, another way to gather another thing to produce ochre. What they did with their pigment, nobody knows, but here it is, evidence of its being produced 100,000 years ago. Well, these are much more familiar to everybody. Lascaux and Chauvet. Magnificent images, to put it mildly. unarguably a symbolic sense, representational symbolic sense, painted deep inside caves using lights, and who knows what else might have been going on as these were created. Or these, almost roughly the same period. We're talking 30,000 plus years in Europe. And oh, how these beautiful artifacts seem to sit comfortably with Eurocentric interpretations of the emergence of humanity. I mean, I love music. I love flute music. But look at that title, earliest musical tradition. 33,000 years, I think, roughly. 35,000 years. But it sounds like it's an unbroken line from Chauvet to Monet, or from these bone flutes to Telemann and Bach. That is not the way it happened. We know now that whoever created these things in Western Europe didn't leave ancestors. I'm sorry, didn't leave descendants. Got that one wrong. Didn't leave descendants. So is Bach a descendant of the person that, no, clearly not. I mean, as much as we know anything, we know that that's not the case. So yes, there are artifacts. We find the artifacts where we have been looking. We also find the artifacts where the climate is conducive to preservation. But this has fueled a mistaken notion of a cultural head start in Western Europe, and for 30,000 years, cultural intellectual supremacy connected all the way back. Now, again, this is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I've not stood next to the original, but I've stood next to reconstructions of this. And I look at that and I just am amazed at what that signifies in terms of the emergence of our humanity. Oh, how I love, let's say, the flute music of J.S. Bach. We can hear it as I look at this. But it's a delusion to think that there's a straight line culturally, or to think that it only appeared here or in one particular place, as if there's something about Germany that favors music or something about France that favors art. This is from the island of Sulawesi. I've never been there, but I've looked at it on a map. It's a very hard place to get to. Nobody traveled back and forth from Lascaux to Sulawesi. And yet here you have paintings that actually predate Lascaux and Chauvet. Now, climate is really critically important, and this is badly degraded. But if we were able to imagine the full original, it would rival what you see in Chauvet. The animal is extinct. It's a so-called deer pig. You see handprints toward the bottom and above it, but there is the full remainder of the animal. In France, yes. In Indonesia, yes. What are we to make of that? Why did it show up at both places at the same time? Were the antecedents carried there by whoever it was exactly who came out of Africa? Or to complicate things even more, back to France, not exactly today's French, these are Neanderthals. Building this site a full 1,000 feet inside a cave, utter darkness, teamwork required, torches, the whole thing. What they did was they used the stalagmites as kind of Lincoln logs. Here it is in a reconstructed format. You can't tell very much looking at this, but this is a sophisticated structure that shows evidence of fire burning alongside. Or here's a cave now dated There's a lot of controversy about this, but dated to something like 64,000 years ago. Neanderthals, well, who else is around then? We don't know for sure, but very likely Neanderthals. Were modern humans around? If not, the Neanderthals. And how does that fit? This 64,000 date with 170,000 date from Brunicle Cave. Did modern humans arrive and then learn anything from Neanderthals? Is there a cultural advance because of that encounter? Again, questions we can only imagine and not answer. So cultural Big Bang, I want to argue against that interpretation and instead for a kind of a view that instead of the big fireworks in the sky, pay attention to the fireflies on a quiet, slow summer evening. That's how the lights go on in human symbolic awareness. Is it still happening? So pivot to this text, close to 70 years old, from Julian Huxley. And I'm going to read this. This is technically precise in its wording. The human species, by which he means now Homo sapiens, can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, but in its entirety as humanity. We need a name for this new belief. Perhaps transhumanism will do. Human, remaining human, but transcending ourselves by realizing new possibilities of and for our human nature. Then he declares, I believe in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that, the human species will be on the threshold of a new kind of existence, as different from ours as ours is from that of Peking man. Now, that needs translation into the present. That would be Homo erectus. Recall the skulls from Denisovans. Brain size significantly smaller than ours. Clearly, Huxley means a big change, a species change. Really, let's think for a moment about transhumanism. The development and the use of technology, it's often defined this way, to free ourselves from the limits of our biology. Well, what are some of those biological limits, the legacies of our evolutionary past? A seemingly fixed lifespan, maxing out at around 120. And then most of us, of course, don't make that. Cognitive capacity seems to be limited. And again, very few of us attain the top levels, but the top levels seem to be limited. Moral limits, and that gets really into some complicated and murky territory. Might it be possible even to use new gene editing techniques to edit the genetic inheritance of humanity so as to produce lasting or so-called germline changes? Is the CRISPR approach to gene editing a technology that could be used toward that end? And a lot of debate over that, as some of you know very well. But what are we to make of these efforts to transcend our biological limits? At what point would transhumanism usher in a new species that means, by definition, the end of our humanity or our of humanism traditionally understood? So some worries about transhumanism. Yeah, sometimes things don't exactly work out. Sometimes they do, but the benefits are not evenly shared. Might we speciate so that humanity splits? We were split in the past. Could we be split in the future? Or if that doesn't worry you, will we create a future that simply doesn't need us? So plenty to talk about in terms of technology and the human future. But folks, I'm more worried, I think, about science and the human past. Until very recently, we could all bask in the protection of the recent out of Africa theory that emerged in the 1990s. According to the theory, Homo sapiens emerged somewhat suddenly in East Africa about 150,000 years ago. We spread around the planet. We've replaced all other forms of humanity. Are we one? Yes, of course. That replaced an earlier, more problematic theory of multi-regionalism, which in its strong form said, oh, well, human early forms of humanity reached multiple continents early on and there continued to evolve in relative isolation, producing different species. Well, that's clearly put to rest here. There's no re-emergence of multi-regionalism, but the classic out of Africa 1990s, with all of its appealing scientific support or affinity toward the affirmation of the unity of humanity, well, that theory is now largely modified, if not outright replaced. Homo sapiens appeared, not in a flash, but piece by piece, trait by trait, all over Africa, beginning more than 300,000 years ago, and became a composite species originating by a process of hybridization, not sudden speciation by mutation, but by a slower process of hybridization. Secondly, this new form of humanity almost immediately spread across the globe, including back to other places in Africa, but spread across the globe and interbred with other forms of humanity, Neandertals, Denisovans, and many, many other forms of archaic humanity, and their DNA is with us now. Multiple points of hybridization, that causes me to worry a little bit. Can diversity in origin revitalize, re-energize views of superiority and inferiority? Because my ancestors evolved in one place, superior to those evolving in another place. Now, clearly, with the new approach, the modified, the qualified out of Africa position, the affirmation from biology is we human beings, as we exist across the planet today, are one species. Our variation is relatively small. For a species with so many individuals, our variation is relatively small. How do we account for that? Introgression, the convergent side of the divergence. Introgression all the way around and all the way back. That's the process by which evolution occurs locally, but never speciates locally. Well, I mean, in the reference to the emergence of Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is the integration of previous divergence. So divergence and convergence seem to be the underlying driver of human evolution. Both are required for the evolution of Homo sapiens. But I look at all of that and I worry about the mischief that it seems always to surround us. Human interactions in history, think of recorded history, think particularly the last 500 years, the era of the conquest of the New World, the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, just think of the history. Has it always? And I put that in question. But I can't think of an example where human divergence has been followed in history by convergence and it's gone well. Gone well for some, I guess, but gone well for everybody. Help me if you can think of an example where separation has been followed by reunification, reunification of our humanity, and it's gone well. Even now, ethnic interaction is not going well. I mean, I don't have to remind you of the news. Rockets fired by bombs, fired by rockets, fired by bombs. I mean, Israel-Palestine just makes us weep. And religion, oh, I wish it helped. I think it has something to say. I think it has something to offer. In white nationalist Christian America, is anybody listening? Religion right now doesn't seem to help. Is there anything that will allow us to live with the reality of who we are and find a way to affirm a peaceful human future? Well, so your suggestions, your comments, your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ron. This was really great. I'd like to now introduce the respondent, who is Dr. James Miller. Jim is a retired teaching elder of the Presbyterian Church. He worked as a Department of Engineering mechanics at North Carolina State University in that department, so he's got a science and religion perspective. Most of his career was in the field of ministry and higher education, and he was on the campuses of Michigan Technical University, University of Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Mellon University, and it's that Pittsburgh connection where Ron and Jim got to know each other. He was the founding secretary treasurer of the Presbyterian Association on Science, Technology, and the Christian Faith, and served as their president and general missioner. Since 2008, he's co-chaired the Broader Science Impacts Committee of the Human Origins Program of the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History. With that, let me introduce Jim, who will provide the response.
Thanks, Gail. It's a pleasure to be on the same program with Ron. Actually, as he was reminding me yesterday, we first met in 1982, and I was kidding him. I said I was his forerunner because I was doing campus ministry at Michigan Tech, and when I left to go back to do graduate work at Marquette University, there was an interim for a year, and then Ron followed as the ecumenical Protestant campus minister there at Michigan Tech. So we've had connections for a long time, been involved in several projects together. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. One of the things I will say about Ron is that of all the theologians that I know, there are a few that I know who are not professional scientists also, but who are as well versed in the scientific literature as Ron is. That's not always a thing that you will find for those, and many in the science religion field who are prepared to offer a theological insight or discussion about scientific developments, but may not have delved as deeply into the scientific literature itself. And so I really have always respected Ron for that. I think his presentation on the increasingly opening up of our understanding of the history of human origins is very important. This is by no means a static field. This is almost sometimes almost every month there's something new that is coming up. The ability to now go in and to sequence paleogenomes has been a remarkable addition to this. This is one of the ways that we ended up discovering, for instance, that we bear genes that are given to us by virtue of the interbreeding of Homo sapiens and Neandertals in a much earlier time. I do think that there is. I think it is fascinating to talk about the way in which what eventually becomes Homo sapiens has biological roots in a variety of places, and as a result of the interbreeding of a variety of species. At the same time, how that itself gets mapped out in any sort of factual way or any sort of described lineages is always going to be very difficult. Even when this was not considered to be the case, doing family trees of hominins has never been easy to do. And as Ron, I think, well pointed out, Mother Nature has never been a great record keeper. So the evidence that's available in order to make these sorts of judgments is not huge. At the same time, there are, as a matter of fact, more fossils in Paleolithic fossils than people often are aware of, and it's on the basis of these that those who study these matters do make their judgments. As in most historical science, there is always judgment that has to be made. The evidence is available, but it is not. It doesn't simply speak for itself. It has to be interpreted and understood. And as I've sometimes said, taxonomy is often the eye of the taxonomer. So the way in which these things come together and form the story that we want to have or want to know about in terms of our own origins as a species is always an ongoing process, and that's part of the excitement of it, as a matter of fact. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what we know about the past. It's very important, and not the least of which I've always wanted to say, I hope that our species has as good a run as Homo erectus does, because that was almost 2 million years. We've got what, 300,000 or 400,000 years under our belt. So we've got a long way to go before we can actually say that we have done as well as some of our progenitors have. That being, and it's also, I think, important to recognize that many of the things that we take for granted and think are so distinctively human, not the least of which, for instance, is the control of fire, is not something that we, as a matter of fact, discovered. It's a legacy that is given to us by previous non-Homo sapien species. Homo erectus, for instance, there's evidence that Homo erectus was able to use fire as well. The other thing, though, I think that is also interesting is that we often think that there are certain human values that are distinctive with regard to Homo sapiens, not the least of which is compassion. Yet there's good evidence in one of those skulls in Denisovans, Homo erectus skulls in Denisovans, is of an old man who is toothless, and he was toothless for quite a period of time because the jaw bones have receded, recessed, showing that he was without teeth for and that has affected his jaw as well. It is unlikely that he could have been able to simply on his own manage his own care without the support of a community. So the one question is this in the Paleolithic record evidence of the existence of compassion within a pre-human, pre-Homo sapien species, so that what we think about as being distinctively human, that is the care for others, is actually something that extends well back beyond our own species. The gifts of the past in terms of our lineage, I think, are things that we need to both remember and are easily forgotten as we think of ourselves as being so unusually adept at our life in the world. In talking about the future, and I want to just say a couple of things about that, and then be done and let other folks get their questions and so forth in. I've often thought that there were three options as far as going forward in the future. One is that we as a species could make an extraordinarily stupid decision and resulted in our own extinction. I mean, there's all kinds of dystopic science fiction that is written about this sort of thing happening. and some people, as a matter of fact, as they write projections or imagine outcomes of our current environmental circumstance, indicate that that there could be very difficult times ahead for ourselves as species, if the climate were to change as radically as it might. That aside, however, there are two other possibilities. One is that, like some other species that we can observe around nature today, they have found environmental niches that are sufficiently small where they've been able to persist for a very long period of time with relatively little evolutionary change. And so perhaps it's a kind of walling ourselves off from those forces that would impact us, and as far as our own evolution, biological evolution. The third possibility, of course, is that we simply evolve and become a new species, just as we are a species that is different from Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis or any of those that are part of the hominin family. And whether that's a biological evolution or whether that is a biotechnological revolution, I think are two questions, is in some sense beside the point. But it's simply that our descendants become, as Huxley suggested, as different from us as we are from Homo erectus. Now, there's a kicker in all of this, and that is that it may also have been true to some extent with previous hominid species, but it is certainly the case with Homo sapiens that we stopped being an animal like other animals. That is feeding, living, bearing offspring, and so forth, and surviving in relationship with the environment in which we find ourselves. Along the way, we stopped doing that and started changing the environment in order to suit us. That ends up being a negative selective factor. That is to say, it allows us to essentially biologically remain more or less the same while changing the world around us to accommodate that. This has nothing to do with changing ourselves necessarily, but it has to do with changing the world in order to make it compatible with our particular interests or needs. Probably the greatest, arguably the greatest impact was the advent of agriculture and the domestication of animals. It not only transformed human culture, but it also transformed the world around us as well. On the question of transhumanism, I don't know about any of the rest of you who are in the audience, but I've had cataract surgery, so I have my eyes are no longer my natural eyes. I also have 2 synthetic knees, which allow me to get around, and I don't suffer the issues of arthritis that you can actually observe in some of our pre-hominin or hominin ancestors that I'm sure created disadvantages for them in their living of their lives. These are interventions, however, that are aimed at overcoming either deterioration or disease effects. Cochlear implants in terms of hearing, ocular implants, which may be on the horizon, various ways in which we all have the potential of becoming $1 million or probably $5 or 10 or 15 $million people as various parts of our organic system get replaced by synthetic elements. This is not too far-fetched a thing to observe because we see it going on around us as it is right now. Remarkable developments in terms of prostheses, which are more and more being connected not simply to other muscles or muscular structure or skeletal structures, but are actually being neurologically connected with people's brains, and so can be operated by virtue of thought and not simply by operation by virtue of some sort of mechanical linkages. So these sorts of interventions, again, are largely aimed at resolving or overcoming some form of disadvantage, either caused by disease or injury or whatever it might be. That's different than saying we're going to give you the capacity to run at 100 miles an hour, or we're going to be able to enable you to breathe underwater without benefit of aqua. I just finished watching Waterworld a little bit ago, and so, Kevin Costner has gills, but anyhow, that's another story. Interventions that are aimed at somebody's idea of what it would be to improve the human species. And I think it's right to ask the question, how in the world do we know what that means? What does improvement look like? Clearly, we have developed technologies that do extend our capacities, whether it be the microscope or the telescope, or for that matter, the digital computer. These are all apparatus that extend our capacity, but they do change us in terms of our cultural functioning, and they may change us in terms of our perception of ourselves and of the world, but we still end up being Homo sapiens that have the same frailties and limitations and so forth that we have inherited as being biological creatures. So while there are increasingly technologies that allow us to intervene in our future, not only in a kind of exterior technological way, but with things like CRISPR on an interior technological way, the question of how you would know what it is to become better is unclear. The one thing we do know is that everything seems to be connected to everything else. And so when you change one thing, it often has effects someplace else. And it is those kinds of unintended consequences that have been an irritation in human culture when there is the great idea to do this, and suddenly you find you not only got this, but you also got that, and that was not what you wanted. Anyhow, let me leave it at that. I do think the question of how in the world would we individually or culturally or governmentally or however make decisions about what it would be to improve our species, it seems to me extremely difficult to accomplish. Anyhow, thanks very much, and thanks, Ron, again for your presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. Enlightening, and just really opened up all kinds of possibilities for conversation. So I really do hope people will jump in with questions, but for a few minutes, a couple of things we might consider. You're pointing to the theme of compassion, the so-called softer side of the evolutionary history. There are people working on that. I think the methods seem to me to be somewhat elusive, but what you pointed to is one of the better examples that seem to hint at something like compassion, the capacity of a community to carry the burden of care for somebody who may not be exactly contributing back to the community in the same way. Look, an altruistic dimension there. Alongside of that, much later in time, I mean, what you're pointing to is close to 2 million years in age, but some of the Neanderthal so-called burials, do they really pass the test of so, lots of challenges there at a technical level. But assuming that they do, does that hint at something more even than compassion, a sense of the continuing identity and presence of the deceased in the community, or at least an honoring of that? Recent publications from the reopening of the Shanidar dig in Iraq point in that direction, but also the Homo naledi. What are the skeletons all doing in this chamber? Who put them there? Was it some sort of burial process? I don't think the evidence is clear one way or the other, but it raises tantalizing questions. Another thing that you mentioned was you referred in a number of ways to technology and the ways in which technology continues to move forward so quickly from the simplest stone tools of the past. One of the things about the tools of the past is that they were used in an indirect way to influence human evolution. And by indirect, I mean the stone tools modify the evolutionary niche in which Darwinian selection is then exercised by, because of stone tools, certain things that were not food sources before are now food sources. That has the effect of modifying the evolutionary niche, which then exercises a kind of selective pressure, opening up new possibilities. Today, we are moving these, we have such powerful tools that we are cutting out the evolutionary, we're using the tools and putting them right into the brain, right into the body, right into the human, and opening up the possibility of a transformation. The cyborg then becomes the image. I use the term hybrid a lot, but the cyborg then becomes the image of the future. What is it, Jim, for you to have surgically implanted lenses or surgically implanted knees? Well, maybe not such a radical breakthrough yet, but one can imagine where these technologies will go in an increasing direction of the human as the cyborg, understood in multiple ways in terms of the cyborg identity, but particularly as the fusion of the organism with the cybernetic system, the original idea of the cyborg as it was put forward. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how that future shapes itself for human, or how humanity reshapes, how we reshape ourselves. I didn't say anything about artificial intelligence, but what will it be like to create not just AI chatbots and Alexa this and Siri that, but actually greater than human intellectual capabilities, not just to beat us in chess or maybe beat us in defined game spaces, but to exceed human capacities for intelligence across the board. When will that happen? How will it happen? What will it mean? And will these emerging intelligent systems want us around anymore? And if so, for what? Might we find ourselves uploading? I'm really skeptical of that, but uploading the content of our brain into some system. Again, I'm skeptical of the metaphysics underpinning that, but will there be something like that where the discrete biological organism ceases to exist and we're somehow absorbed into a intelligence that we produce but no longer control? Just a final comment, I guess, on the, you raised some absolutely fascinating questions about the technologies of the future, the impact of the transhumanist debate. I think you used the word enhancement. I'm not sure I did in my original talk, but the word enhancement is clearly the key word here. almost everybody is comfortable with the latest biomedical research for therapy. Restoring lost capacities up to a point, at least, restoring the function of our eyes or our knees or whatever part of the body that is impaired by disease or injury. Therapy. Just about everybody's for that. When does therapy cross over into enhancement? And as it crosses over and becomes clearly enhancement, who's to say, as you put it so well, who's to define what's good? Who's to define what is truly beneficial? And then you alluded to the possibility that there may be some collective wisdom brought to bear. I am not sure about that. I just don't know. From people working in secular bioethics on these themes, a number of them are clear to point out that we lack we lack a shared view, certainly a compelling shared view of human enhancement. What is good for humanity? This brings up debates about human flourishing. What is human flourishing? In a bizarre way, it's anchored. You left Pennsylvania maybe too soon, my friend. Some of our license plates with a spinoff on the Declaration of Independence, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some of our license plates say, pursue your happiness, right? You have a right to pursue, a God-given right to pursue your happiness. Well, implied in that, for most Americans in our almost irrepressible libertarian moments, implied in that is the right to define the happiness that I will pursue. No one, not the government, not the church, not some authority, is going to tell me what is good for me or what in what my happiness consists. I have the right to define it and pursue it, or so we think. And you're pushing back. I think I share the desire to push back, but I don't know the mechanism by which a secular pluralistic society can ever come to any kind of consensus about in what does human flourishing consist? In what does human happiness actually consist? It's a debate that goes back 2,400, 2,500 years to Aristotle. I'm not sure we have a clear answer to that question. We all pursue happiness, but we all insist on defining our happiness idiosyncratically, at least up to a point, as long as my happiness doesn't interfere with yours, of course. There are some constraints on that. But by and large, we let people define what it means to be fully human, what it means to benefit their humanity, what forms of enhancement seem comfortable to them, and what forms seem to be off the table. That's sort of the pluralistic liberal society in which we live. Will it get us into trouble? Probably so. How do we avoid that trouble? Conversations like this, I think, your version of happiness may be legal, but we challenge each other. Okay, you can pursue that, but really, do you want to think that through a little bit more carefully in a community of conversation with like-minded people who are not saying no so much as let's just think this through at a deeper and deeper level. Well, thank you, Jim. I'm gonna wrap up, and I think we go back to Gail, who's going to queue up questions, or wherever you're going to go.
And I'll sort of moderate the questions as we go through. One question is, can you comment on the role of epigenetics in evolution? Our DNA is not so different from chimpanzees, so how much of the epigenetics is playing a feature there?
Yeah, well, Gail, you certainly know your way around the technical side of that far better than I do, but my impression is that the development of each organism is profoundly influenced by epigenetic processes and functions. I'm not sure that we know yet how much species function, much less species evolution, is influenced by these processes. In fact, I'm not, maybe you know the answer to this. How much can paleogenomics enlighten us at all on epigenetics? And if so, what light does it shed? Well, I have more to say, but let me bounce that, Gail, back to you, because I know
No,
you.
I mean, I'll answer as best I can, which is that epigenetics is very hard to look at from a simple gene sequence perspective, which is what we're getting from these, as you've pointed out, from these genomic studies. So I don't think we know the answer to this question. I do think it's fascinating, though. Really important question. Okay, I'm going to move on. There are two questions that ask about the new story movement. As we struggle with religion in its diversity, which shows no sign of promoting unity of all cultures, is it possible that a new common story that is applicable to all humans on the planet could become the primary force to facilitate our future common needs? The number of new story movements based on the work of Thomas Berry are expanding and becoming widespread. The challenge is how to spread the new understanding that we are in fact living in a highly interdependent world. And then there's another comment similarly that says that the new story movement encompasses compassion along with other supportive human behaviors and emotions.
Yeah, I think that's very promising. The challenge will be to win converts on a big enough scale to make a noticeable difference. And I honestly don't know how that's going. Maybe somebody wants to chime in with a comment in the Q&A on that. But I know the pushback within Christianity when it comes to even tinkering with ideas of biblical interpretation of the old story. And yeah, I mean, there are comfortable circles, and I happen to live in one, comfortable circles in which liberal and critical and deconstructive ideas are tolerated, in fact, welcomed. But those are not the, we're not winning the numbers games here, folks. The pushback from conservative voices seems to be pretty strong at the moment. And I think the conflict among religions heightens that kind of brittleness. No, we don't want a new story. We're going to dig into our old story. I mean, my heart is with you, folks, but I'm not, and I want to cheer you on, those of you who advocate for this kind of a new story approach. But well, let me put it this way. I'll take help from any corner. I mean, I really mean very seriously and with a note of sadness, the final line on the penultimate slide. Religion doesn't seem to be helping. What can? Clearly, this approach can help. How big a help is it going to be? Would be my question in response.
Looks like Jim wants to join in on this too. Go ahead, Jim.
J.V.S. Haldane has this line that God must have an inordinate love of beetles because he made so many different kinds of them. This notion of, if you look at the evolutionary history, what we get on and on and on is more and more stuff, different kinds of stuff. Now, granted, there's a narrowing as well. We're, as Rick Potts likes to say, we're the last hominid standing, and that's true in terms of species. So there's narrowing and expansion as well, but variety of story, it seems to me, is not what's at issue. Is part of what's at issue is the inability of those who are telling stories to talk to one another. John Cobb has a wonderful book called Beyond Dialogue. He was very interested, by virtue of his own history, in the dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism. And he said, one of the things that you have in dialogue is I'll show you mine and you can show me yours, but there's a part of me that's going to be invulnerable to anything you say.
Mm.
If you make yourself vulnerable to what the other has to say out of their life and experience and so forth, it doesn't mean that you become them, nor that somehow the two of you become a Hegelian third thing, but rather that you become changed by virtue of the engagement and they become changed by virtue of the engagement, and you both become new things.
Right.
And it seems to me that it's that willingness to be vulnerable to the other, to their story, in hope that, as a matter of fact, by hearing them, you don't simply adopt their story, but your story changes by virtue of that engagement, that encounter. And it seems to me that it's where the other becomes threat or enemy or that to be either avoided or disposed of, that we find ourselves in difficulty. And rather than the other being, as a matter of fact, a source of enlightenment. That it seems to me is where the challenge lies. So I'm not concerned about having one story. I like lots of stories. I like anthologies. It doesn't have to be a single novel to be enlightening. So it seems to me that while I do find myself resonant with those who want to tell their story in relationship to what we've learned about the world in which we live, and that science has been a great contributor to helping us understand what that world is like. I don't expect that anybody else's story is going to be exactly like mine. So, and I gain from the fact that other people's story is, as a matter of fact, isn't like mine.
And
Great,
Gail, if I may cut back in at this point.
Yeah, please, Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, Jim's comment about dialogue is oddly an echo of what we were saying earlier about human evolution, divergence and convergence. Are we now at a moment of converging, not so much our DNA, that having happened, but converging our stories? That would be a really optimistic view of things. Is there an account that honors, recognizes, validates, and somehow embraces all of the various accounts of the ways in which human life flourishes, that brings it all together in a harmonious whole? It would fit the broader evolutionary pattern. That doesn't mean it's going to happen in terms of human cultural history, but it's certainly there as a possibility.
Great, thanks, Ron. There are a couple of questions that are coming up about income disparity. So there's one comment that says that the news story approach will be very challenging as long as we have income disparity, with so few having so much and so many having lives of desperation. And then there's a mention of Robert Putnam's new book, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. But then there's a very specific question. And the question says, could you comment on the social inequity issues around biological improvements, such as knee replacements, which by their nature will only be available in relatively very few people?
Yeah, or we could switch the frame of reference to COVID vaccines.
And there's a reference to a COVID vaccine in another question as well. So may as well go after that as well.
Yeah, go ahead. So yeah, it's appalling when it's relatively simple technology. Life or death hangs in the balance and it's gummed up. Now, I know science costs money and intellectual property, that's got to be factored in one way or the other. Somebody pays. But to think that we are holding back knowledge and people are dying as a result or will die as a result is just, I assume everybody on the call here would agree that is appalling beyond words. Knee replacements, well, that may fall a little further down the list, but still, that's fundamental mobility for a lot of people, and these other technologies as well. Can we overcome income and wealth disparities in the medicine we all value. And the track record is not really very good. Are we getting better? I mean, we can debate that. Obamacare, et cetera, we can debate that. Globally, again, not a very good track record. But the really troubling thing, I think, is when it comes to enhancement, suppose, this is a big if, suppose we had the technology to modify the DNA of future offspring so as to boost their intelligence or just boost their lifelong health. But let's say boost their intelligence, but it costs a good chunk of money. Would we be taking today's income and wealth disparities and turning them into biological disparities? Again, really big assumptions in framing that question, but I can't dismiss the question just because of the size of the assumptions that we could do this and it would be meaningful. I can't dismiss the question. Are today's financial advantages turned into something like physical advantages in the next generation? And if so, then, my friends, we're in a different space there in terms of injustice coming in unfair distributions of technology. That just opens up a whole different realm of concerns.
Great, thanks, Ron. I'm going to give one quick question. This is a question that could take years to answer, so I'm giving you only a minute or so to answer it. The end of humanity a worry? Couldn't that be seen as rather arrogant? How about an interpretation that sees the end of humanity as a privilege of participating in the glorious ongoing creation of God, to put it theologically?
It sounds like somebody's read my book, The End of Adam and Eve. It's a pun in the title, of course. Now, I've kind of backed off in this context of laying too much sort of Christian stuff on you, but I think that's clearly where Christianity wants to move. The end of humanity is the transformation of humanity and the culmination of the unity of the human and the divine in a glorious transfiguration. I mean, it's not to cling to the humanity of the present, but rather to let it go in order to become something radically different, individually, but collectively as well. So at one level, I agree with the premise of the question. And that's the pun in the title, The End of Adam and Eve. Well, it's the end of humanism. It's the end of this human self in the transformation of the human into something considerably more. Do other religions offer similar hints at what that might be? My guess is they probably do, and maybe there would be a lot to be gained by coming together across various traditions to reflect on kind of the core of that question. What is the promise of the end of humanity? Scientifically, technically, philosophically, religiously, dare we imagine it being well, there's a biblical phrase, the glorious freedom of the children of God, for instance, or again, the transfiguration of our humanity into something far more glorious than we dream. Those are some of the images that Christianity would bring to the table, but I'm sure there are more, and it would be just really fascinating to ponder what that might mean. I'm not sure I've got, maybe Gail, if you want to go back into that question, you're right, it would take a long time to answer, but I hope I've pointed at least in the right direction.
I think so. I think you did. That was great. And Ron, thank you. Jim, thank you. I mean, I'm going to have to close this because we're at our closing time, but I would say there would be thunderous applause if we were in a room with you.